First tonight, a new round of Gaza ceasefire negotiations are underway in Doha, but with no sign that Hamas is willing to join the talks. The Palestinian armed group says it will not participate, and it's accused the Israelis of adding new conditions to existing proposals, something which Israel denies. Correspondents say expectations are low and that there are lots of sticking points. A ceasefire and hostage return deal is considered key to stopping the Gaza conflict from spiraling into all-out war. Meanwhile, the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza says more than 40,000 Palestinians have been killed since the war started with Israel. The total number, 40,005. 300 Israeli soldiers have been killed in Gaza in that time, and it follows the massacre of October the 7th, in which 1,200 people were killed in southern Israel.
Talks are moving forward today in Doha. President Biden directed Director Burns and Brett McGurk to participate for the United States. They're on the ground right now working with representatives from Israel, Qatar, and Egypt. Qatar and Egypt are in turn mediating with Hamas. The resumption of these talks is an important step. And in the lead up to this meeting, we'd already narrowed some gaps. Today, we are focused on the details of the implementation of the agreement. There remains a lot of work to do given the complexity of the agreement. We do not anticipate coming out of these talks today with a deal. In fact, I'd expect the talks to continue into tomorrow. This is vital work. The remaining obstacles can be overcome, and we must bring this process to a close. We need to see the hostages released, relief for Palestinian civilians in Gaza, security for Israel, and lower tensions in the region. And we need to see those things as soon as possible. In the past, it has worked very similar to how it's working in Doha today, where mediators will sit and discuss, work things out, and then those mediators will be in touch with Hamas. And then the Hamas leaders in Doha then communicate directly with Mr. Sinwar for final answers. So the process that is playing out in Doha is very much in keeping with the process that has played out in the past.
Well, for more on those talks and related developments in the Middle East, let's cross live now to Tel Aviv and speak with Arise special correspondent Karl Bostic. Good to see you, Karl. So the talks are underway, but Hamas is not taking part. In those circumstances, can these talks lead to a ceasefire and a hostage and prisoner swap?
That's right, Charles. Actually, there's a lot of pessimism on this because, without active Hamas participation, a breakthrough that would end this 10-month war is still considered remote. But to put things in perspective, Charles, you need to consider this. Even though, throughout these 10 months of negotiations, Charles, Israel and Hamas have never met face to face around the same table. Hamas has always, gone through its mediators, acting on its behalf with Qatar and Egypt, who in turn relay, the response from Hamas to Israel and the U.S. That's always been going on for the past 10 months, Charles. So that's not new. And in fact, the White House spokesperson, John Kirby, says that this process is no different than it was before. I mean, what's new, what's different, Charles, is that there's a real sense of perception that this is the best last chance to get a deal through, just because of so much that's at stake right now. In other words, Hamas is saying that they want to go back to the plan that was proposed by Biden's White House back in May and June and July, and they're simply saying that they don't want to negotiate any further. The two biggest sticking points is that Israel maybe wants to stay indefinitely on the border of Gaza and Egypt because that's where the tunnels were. That was a lifeline for arms to be smuggled and to build the tunnels. They want to stay there until further notice. They also want to bisect the Gaza Strip, Charles. Keep in mind, Gaza Strip is no more than a quarter of the size of Abuja. And they want to be able to actually screen people moving back from the south to the north. You're talking about 1 million people, Charles, out of a 2 million population. They want to basically be able to search and screen the men from carrying arms, because that's where part of the threat comes in. Meanwhile, the U.S. is saying Hamas no longer poses a threat it did 10 months ago. Whatever they wanted to achieve militarily, they've done so, with eradicating most of the leadership, but of course not Yahweh Sinwar. And speaking of him, Charles, any final decision goes back to him. But, the past 10 months, he's living under tunnels. So no one in Qatar on the ground can give a final agreement with Israel without it getting back to Sinwar. But then it goes through that sort of journey. So it's so complicated, Charles. And meanwhile, in terms of how Iran or Hezbollah will respond, Iran is really less likely to respond directly. That's the perception here in Israel, where I am, because so much is at stake. Because there's so many ways in which Israel, the U.S. could respond. Yesterday, there were Israeli reports of a cyber attack in Tehran, where people could not withdraw money from the banks, where the ATM machines were saying that this is in response to Iran's support for Hamas in the war. And meanwhile, the U.S. is telegraphing its determination to stand by Israel, sending an aircraft carrier group, sending a nuclear-powered submarine with guided missiles. They don't announce those things ever. And this is very rare for them to do so. And then also a squadron of F-22 fighter planes, which is the most advanced warplane that the U.S. has. So if anything, it's less likely that Iran would respond directly in the way in which it did back in April, Charles, but it could be Hezbollah that could respond, because in both cases, they feel humiliated by these assassinations on their own soil, which really revealed a breach in security. Finally, Charles, a few days from now, the beginning of the Democratic National Convention in the U.S. The last thing the U.S. wants, Charles, is a regional war breaking out, just as the Democratic Convention to nominate Kamala Harris is about to begin.
Indeed. And just returning to those talks in Doha, we understand that Israel has sent a high-level delegation. In the past, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been accused of only sending delegations who have the mandate to listen, but this one has the power to negotiate, apparently.
Well, if that's so, Charles, this is a big development, because, yes, the head of the delegation is led by the head of the Mossad intelligence, Barnea. And in fact, the opposition member, Benny Gantz, has said publicly, Bibi Netanyahu, this is the time to for once be brave, for once show courage, because he's criticized internally for balking at an agreement to that would receive the release of the hostages, Charles. Because the internal conversation here, Charles, in Israel is what's more important: getting the hostages, the ones who are alive, and also the remains of those who are no longer alive, who are dead, returned to Israel, or to continue grinding out a war with limited returns. And just to give you a perfect example, Charles, just the other day, because of a recent Israeli airstrike in Gaza, Hamas came out and said that a hostage had been killed and 2 female hostages were critically injured. It turns out, further reports saying, and even Hamas admitted it, the hostage that was killed was by a guard who was outraged that 2 of his children were killed by an Israeli strike. So, Charles, you have 115 hostages, both living and no longer alive, who are outstanding. They say that 40 are probably no longer alive. And in social media, it's saying that maybe no more than 30 or so are alive, meaning 70 or 80 have already been killed. And in terms of the female hostages, no one wants to speculate what's really happened to them. So that's why there's real, a conflict here in turmoil, Charles, internally about, what are the priorities of this government? Netanyahu staying in power to avoid the blame and responsibility for what happened on October 7th, or getting back the hostages, even if it's too high a price to pay, meaning Hamas could still be in power.
Well, absolutely. And talking about conflict, we hear that there's a lot of it within the Israeli delegation, and what appears to be something close to a mutiny within the Israeli army, who are saying that, the government needs to come to a deal now because that they've done everything that they can do militarily. I mean, I wonder what you're hearing about that.
That's exactly right, Charles. In fact, you've got the biggest split is between Netanyahu and the defense minister Yoav Gallant, who's saying that all we need to achieve militarily, we pretty much have done. Right now, Charles, it's a game of whack-a-mole. That's the game where you hit someone somewhere, knock them out, but then it pops up somewhere else. And that's what's going on right now, Charles. They've destroyed most of the tunnel system, eradicated most of the leadership, not Yahweh Sinwar, of course. So when they, have these strikes, they take out these operatives. they pop up somewhere else. This is happening on a near daily basis, but with limited returns and with increasing civilian casualties. That's why you have more than 40,000 people killed, and that's probably an undercount, Charles, because people are saying that's being reported also from the UN that thousands of more are probably buried beneath the rubble, and then not all of those who have been killed are being taken to the morgue. So there really are limited military returns there. And that's why the defense is saying, we can't go on like this. Meanwhile, as they're preparing for war, a second front in the north against Hezbollah, and they're stretched in terms of manpower, Charles. They've increased reserve duty, by another 2 months or so. That's how badly stretched they are. So they really are very frustrated and angry with Netanyahu. Some are saying he's trying to actually replace his defense leadership.
So, I mean, is there a time limit on these talks in Doha? I mean, I'm wondering how long they have to make a deal, how long these talks are expected to last.
Well, I can tell you the mood on the ground is very simply that they are preparing and expecting an attack of some sort, not from Iran directly, then from Hezbollah. The thing to keep in mind is this, Charles. We're not talking about a one-off strike. We're talking about days of attacks. That's still very, very imminent, days of attacks. Last night I spoke to you about the northern town of Haifa, where the leading hospital, Rambam Hospital, the parking garage, underground parking garage, 3 levels have been converted to an operating hospital with 2,000 plus beds. In Israel, in Tel Aviv, where I am, it's the same thing, where they're upgrading their shelters. Where I am in Tel Aviv, it's 130 miles from the Lebanese border. Hezbollah has the arsenal to strike anywhere in Israel, but they haven't used it yet. That's the fear. But as far as Hezbollah and even Iran is concerned, already the war has started in terms of response because people are paralyzed in the sense that business is down, people are not going out. There's all this uncertainty. So what we're going through right now, really, Charles, is the first phase of the response because it's been intense psychological war for these past 2 weeks with all this uncertainty following those 2 assassinations.
Karl, thank you very much indeed. Karl Bostic is a RISE special correspondent. He was talking to me on the line there from Tel Aviv.